I was standing in my late uncle's kitchen in Prescott, Arizona, when the doorbell rang for the third time in 10 minutes, and I knew whoever was out there wasn't going away until they got what they wanted. My uncle Gerald Owens had died 6 months ago, leaving me his property in a quiet development called Sunset Ridge Estates. I hadn't been able to visit much during his final years because of my work overseas, and apparently that absence had created some confusion. The kind of confusion that involved a middle-aged woman with a severe bob haircut now pounding on the door like she was trying to break through it. I opened the door to find her standing there with a clipboard, her face twisted into an expression somewhere between outrage and vindication. She wore a crisp white polo shirt with an embroidered logo that read Sunset Ridge HOA and khaki capris that looked like they'd been ironed with military precision. "You have exactly 5 minutes to vacate this property before I call the police," she announced, not even bothering with a greeting. "This is HOA property and you are trespassing." I blinked at her, genuinely confused. "Excuse me. Don't play dumb with me. I'm Patricia Whitmore, president of the Sunset Ridge HOA board, and I know squatters when I see them. This property was abandoned years ago, and we've maintained it at considerable expense to the association." I felt my jaw tighten. "This isn't HOA property. This is my property. I inherited it from my uncle, Gerald Owens." Patricia let out a bark of laughter that had absolutely no humor in it. Gerald Owens. That man disappeared 4 years ago. When property is abandoned for more than 3 years in Arizona, it reverts to the HOA according to our bylaws. We've been maintaining this house, paying for landscaping, repairs, everything. You can't just walk in here and claim ownership. "I'm not claiming ownership. I have ownership. I have the deed, the will, and every legal document necessary to prove this property belongs to me." I kept my voice level, though anger was starting to simmer beneath the surface. She narrowed her eyes at me. "I don't care what fake documents you've printed off the internet. This property belongs to the HOA, and we've already begun the process of selling it to recoup our expenses. You need to leave immediately, or I will have you arrested." I pulled out my phone and opened the Photos app, scrolling to the images I'd taken of the deed and will. "Look, my name is Gregory Owens. Gerald was my uncle. He left me this property when he died. I have the original documents in my car if you want to see them." Patricia didn't even glance at my phone. "I don't need to see anything. I know what I know. Your uncle, if he even existed, abandoned this property years ago. The HOA has rights. Now get out before I make this ugly." "It's already ugly," I said, my patience wearing thin. "And you're the one who's going to need to leave. This is my property and you're harassing me on my own doorstep." Her face flushed red. "How dare you speak to me that way? I am the HOA president. I have authority over every property in this development, including this one." "Actually, you don't. Not over property you don't own, and you definitely don't own this one." Patricia jabbed a finger at me. "You'll be hearing from our lawyer, and don't think you can just squat here in the meantime. I'll make sure code enforcement is here tomorrow to inspect every inch of this place. One violation and you're out." She turned on her heel and marched back to her golf cart, which was parked at an aggressive angle across my driveway. I watched her drive away, already pulling out her phone to presumably call someone about the situation. I closed the door and leaned against it, rubbing my temples. This wasn't how I'd expected my first day as a homeowner to go. The house itself was in surprisingly good condition for a place that supposedly hadn't had an owner for 4 years. The furniture was dusty but intact, the appliances worked, and aside from some minor cosmetic issues, everything seemed functional. If the HOA had really been maintaining it, they'd done a decent job. but that didn't give them any right to claim ownership. I pulled out the folder of documents I'd brought with me from my car. The deed clearly showed the property transferred to me upon Gerald's death. The will was properly executed and had gone through probate without any issues. My lawyer back in Portland had assured me everything was in order before I made the drive down to Arizona. My phone buzzed with an email notification. I opened it to find a message from an address labeled Sunset Ridge HOA with the subject line Notice of Trespass and Legal Action. I opened it, scanning the formal language and threats. According to Patricia's email, I had 24 hours to vacate the property or face legal action for trespassing, property theft, and fraud. She also claimed the HOA had invested over $50,000 in maintaining the property and intended to sue for those costs plus damages. I forwarded the email to my lawyer, Sarah, with a brief explanation of what had just happened. Her response came back within minutes. Don't leave. Don't let them intimidate you. Send me everything you have about the property and their claims. This sounds like attempted theft by the HOA, not the other way around. I spent the next hour scanning and emailing documents, then started going through the house more carefully. My uncle had been a meticulous record keeper, and I found a filing cabinet in his office filled with years of correspondence. Most of it was routine bills and personal letters, but one folder caught my attention. It was labeled HOA Issues and was thick with papers. I pulled it out and started reading. What I found made my blood run cold. 4 years ago, my uncle had gotten into a dispute with the HOA over some modifications he'd wanted to make to his backyard. The correspondence started polite, but quickly devolved into threats and intimidation. Patricia's name appeared frequently, along with increasingly aggressive demands for compliance with HOA rules. Then, I found a letter from 3.5 years ago. It was from Patricia to my uncle, informing him that due to his continued violations and refusal to cooperate with HOA regulations, they were considering declaring his property abandoned and assuming control of it for the good of the community. My uncle's response was scathing. He pointed out that he lived in the house full-time, paid all his bills, and couldn't possibly be considered to have abandoned anything. He also noted that the HOA had no legal authority to seize property from homeowners, regardless of any disputes. The next letter in the file was even more disturbing. It was from the HOA's lawyer at the time, claiming that my uncle's extended absence from the property gave them grounds to assume abandonment. My uncle had written lies across the top in red ink and attached a response from his own lawyer explaining that he had never been absent from the property for more than a week at a time for medical appointments. The correspondence continued for several months, getting increasingly hostile on the HOA's side. Then, about 3 years ago, the letters stopped. But tucked in the back of the folder was a handwritten note from my uncle, dated 2 years and 8 months ago. They're watching the house constantly. Patricia drives by multiple times a day. I caught someone from the HOA trying to look through my windows last night. I've installed security cameras and deadbolts on all the doors. My lawyer says they have no legal standing, but they won't stop harassing me. I'm documenting everything in case something happens to me. I sat back in the desk chair, my heart pounding. My uncle hadn't abandoned the property at all. The HOA had been trying to force him out, and when that didn't work, they'd apparently waited until he died and then claimed abandonment. But why hadn't they known he died? I'd inherited the property 6 months ago, but according to Patricia, they thought he'd been gone for 4 years. That didn't make sense unless they'd simply assumed he'd left and hadn't bothered to verify. or unless they'd done something to make him leave and wanted everyone to believe it had been years ago. I shook off that dark thought and kept looking through the papers. Near the bottom of the stack, I found something that made everything click into place. It was a purchase offer from 3 years ago, addressed to my uncle from a real estate development company called Summit Properties LLC. They were offering to buy his property for well above market value. Attached to the offer was a note in my uncle's handwriting. Patricia Whitmore is listed as VP of Summit Properties. This whole thing is a scam to steal my house and resell it for profit. I grabbed my laptop and started searching for Summit Properties LLC. It took some digging through Arizona's corporation records, but I found it. The company had been registered 3 years ago, and the listed officers were Patricia Whitmore as vice president and her husband, Richard Whitmore, as president. They'd been trying to force my uncle off his property so they could seize it through the HOA and then sell it through their development company. When he died, they must have seen it as their opportunity to finally take what they wanted. My phone rang. It was Sarah, my lawyer. "Gregory, I've reviewed everything you sent. This is worse than I thought. The HOA has been fraudulently claiming ownership of your property for months. According to public records, they've actually listed it as an HOA asset and have been showing it to potential buyers. They've been trying to sell my house. Not just trying. They have it listed with a realtor right now for $375,000. The listing went up 2 months ago. I felt like I'd been punched in the gut. How is that even possible? Don't they need to actually own the property to sell it? They've filed false documents claiming the property was abandoned and properly transferred to HOA ownership, according to their bylaws. But here's the thing. Arizona law doesn't allow HOAs to simply seize abandoned property. There's a whole legal process that has to be followed, and they didn't follow any of it. What they're doing is fraud and possibly theft. So what do I do? First, don't leave that property. Document everything. If they try to remove you physically, call the police immediately. Second, I'm going to file an emergency injunction to stop any sale of the property and to establish your rightful ownership. Third, you need to gather any evidence you can find about their scheme. It sounds like your uncle documented a lot of it, which will help. We talked for another 20 minutes about strategy and next steps. By the time I hung up, I had a clear plan of action, but I also had a knot of anxiety in my stomach. I was up against people who had no problem lying and breaking the law to get what they wanted. The next morning, I was woken at 6:30 by someone pounding on the front door. I stumbled out of the guest bedroom where I'd slept and opened the door to find a man in a code enforcement uniform standing there with a clipboard. "I'm here to conduct an inspection of the property," he announced. "I have complaints of numerous violations." "Do you have a warrant?" I asked, still half asleep. He looked annoyed. "I don't need a warrant for an exterior inspection, but if you refuse to let me inspect the interior, I can get one." "Then get one." "I'm not letting you in without proper legal authorization." His expression hardened. "You're making this difficult for yourself. The HOA has the right to ensure all properties meet code. The HOA has the right to ensure common areas meet code. This is private property, and unless you have specific evidence of violations that pose a health or safety risk, you need a warrant to enter." I'd done my research the night before, reading up on Arizona property law and HOA regulations. I knew my rights, and I wasn't about to let them intimidate me into giving them up. The inspector made a show of walking around the exterior of the house, taking notes and photos. I watched from the window as he measured the grass height, examined the fence, and studied the paint on the exterior walls. When he finished, he marched back to the front door and handed me a citation. Your mailbox is 2 inches shorter than HOA standards require. Your grass is 1/4 inch longer than regulations allow, and your exterior paint color is not on the approved list. You have 7 days to correct these violations or face fines of $500 per day per violation. I looked at the citation in disbelief. This is harassment. The mailbox was installed by the original developer. The grass is perfectly normal, and the paint is the same color it's been for 15 years. Rules change. You need to comply. 7 days. He walked back to his truck and drove away. I called Sarah immediately and sent her photos of the citation. Her response was swift and angry. They're trying to bury you in fines to force you out. Don't pay anything. We'll fight this. In the meantime, I'm filing a harassment complaint along with the injunction. The harassment didn't stop with the citation. Over the next 3 days, I had visits from the fire marshal, someone claiming to be from the health department, and 2 different HOA board members, all trying to find reasons to force me off the property. Patricia herself showed up on the 4th day, this time with a man who introduced himself as Richard Whitmore, her husband and the HOA's legal counsel. He was tall and thin with slicked back hair and a suit that probably cost more than my monthly rent back in Portland. "Mr. Owens," Richard said in a smooth voice that set my teeth on edge, "we seem to have gotten off on the wrong foot. My wife tells me you're claiming to have inherited this property from Gerald Owens. I'm not claiming anything. I did inherit it. I have all the legal documentation to prove it." "I'm sure you have documents. The question is whether they're legitimate. You see, we have considerable documentation showing that Gerald Owens abandoned this property nearly 4 years ago. We've maintained it at significant expense, and we have legal grounds to claim ownership through adverse possession." I stared at him. Adverse possession requires continuous possession for 10 years in Arizona. You couldn't possibly have met that requirement. His smile didn't waver. "Actually, the requirement can be as little as 2 years if certain conditions are met, and we've met those conditions." "No, you haven't. My uncle never abandoned this property. He lived here until he went into hospice care 6 months before his death. I have medical records and testimony from neighbors to prove it." For the first time, Richard's smile faltered slightly. "I think you're mistaken about the timeline. I'm not, and I have documentation that shows you and your wife have been trying to steal this property for years. I found all of my uncle's correspondence with the HOA. I know about Summit Properties. I know you tried to force him out so you could seize the house and sell it for profit." Patricia's face went white. "That's a lie. We would never. There are emails, letters, purchase offers with your company letterhead. My uncle documented everything." Richard's expression turned cold. "If you had any such documentation, which I doubt, it would prove nothing. HOA boards have every right to purchase properties from homeowners. There's nothing illegal about that. There is when you manufacture false claims of abandonment to seize the property without paying for it. That's fraud, and possibly theft." "You have no idea what you're talking about," Patricia snapped. "We've done everything by the book." "Your uncle was a difficult, obstinate man who refused to follow basic community rules. When he left, he didn't leave. He died, here in this house, 6 months ago. And before that, he lived here continuously." Richard held up a hand to stop his wife from responding. "This conversation is going nowhere. We'll see you in court, Mr. Owens. And I should warn you, we have significant resources and the full backing of the HOA. You're going to lose, and when you do, you'll be responsible for all our legal fees in addition to vacating the property." They left, and I immediately called Sarah to tell her about the conversation. "They threatened you with their legal resources. That's rich considering I just found out their HOA is broke. They've been operating at a deficit for 2 years because Patricia and Richard have been embezzling funds to support their development company. How did you find that out? I have a friend who's a forensic accountant. She did some preliminary digging into the HOA's finances as a favor. The numbers don't add up. Large amounts of money have been transferred out to maintenance and legal expenses that don't correspond to any actual services rendered. The money went to shell companies owned by Summit Properties. This was bigger than just my property. They'd been stealing from every homeowner in the development. What do we do with that information? We're gathering more evidence, then we're going to the district attorney. But in the meantime, we focus on establishing your ownership and getting that injunction. The hearing is scheduled for tomorrow morning. The hearing took place in a small courtroom in Prescott. I sat with Sarah at one table while Richard Whitmore and another lawyer representing the HOA sat at the other. Patricia was in the gallery, her arms crossed and her expression furious. The judge, a woman in her 60s named Judge Morrison, reviewed the documents from both sides in silence for what felt like an eternity. Finally, she looked up. Let me make sure I understand the HOA's position. You're claiming that Gerald Owens abandoned this property 4 years ago, and that you've maintained it since then at your own expense, giving you grounds to claim ownership through adverse possession. That's correct, Your Honor, Richard said smoothly. We have documentation of our maintenance expenses and records showing Mr. Owens' absence from the property. And Mr. Owens, the judge turned to me, you're claiming that you inherited this property from your uncle 6 months ago and that he never abandoned it. Yes, Your Honor. I have the deed, the will, probate records, and documentation showing my uncle lived in the property until he entered hospice care shortly before his death. The judge nodded. I've reviewed your deed and will. They appear to be in order. Mr. Whitmore, what evidence do you have that Gerald Owens abandoned the property 4 years ago? Richard shuffled through his papers. We have reports from HOA board members who observed the property appearing vacant. No cars in the driveway, no lights on at night, no response to HOA correspondence. Do you have any official documentation, death certificate, missing person report, anything from law enforcement or government agencies? Well, no, Your Honor. We relied on our own observations. Did you attempt to verify Mr. Owens' status? Check with the post office, utility companies, property tax records. Richard hesitated. We relied on the information available to us through normal HOA oversight. The judge's expression suggested she wasn't impressed. Mr. Owens, do you have utility records or other evidence showing the property was occupied? Sarah stood up. Yes, Your Honor. We have utility bills showing continuous service and usage throughout the period in question. We also have property tax records showing Gerald Owens paid his taxes every year up until his death. We have medical records showing he received home health care services at this address. And we have affidavits from 3 neighbors who confirm they saw Gerald Owens regularly at the property up until he became ill last year. She handed a thick folder to the bailiff, who passed it to the judge. Judge Morrison spent several minutes reviewing the documents. When she looked up, her expression was stern. Mr. Whitmore, your claim of abandonment appears to be completely unfounded. The evidence clearly shows Gerald Owens occupied this property until his death. Your adverse possession claim fails on its face. Your Honor, if I may, Richard started. You may not. I'm not finished. Furthermore, I'm troubled by the HOA's conduct in this matter. You filed documents with the county claiming ownership of property that clearly doesn't belong to you. You've attempted to sell that property, and you've harassed the rightful owner. These actions appear to constitute fraud and possibly theft. Patricia made a choking sound from the gallery. I'm granting Mr. Owen's motion for an emergency injunction. The HOA is hereby prohibited from claiming any ownership interest in the property, from attempting to sell it, from entering it without permission, and from any further harassment of Mr. Owens. Additionally, I'm ordering the HOA to remove any false claims of ownership from public records within 48 hours. Your Honor, this is highly irregular, Richard protested. What's irregular is an HOA attempting to steal a homeowner's property. This injunction will remain in place pending a full hearing on Mr. Owen's complaint. And Mr. Whitmore, I strongly suggest you advise your clients to consult with independent legal counsel because they may be facing criminal charges. The gavel came down, and the hearing was over. I felt like I could breathe for the first time in days. Patricia stormed out of the courtroom without looking at me. Richard gathered his papers with tight, controlled movements, his jaw clenched. Sarah and I walked out of the courthouse into the bright Arizona sunshine. That went better than I expected, she said with a satisfied smile. What happens now? Now we file a full lawsuit against the HOA for fraud, harassment, and attempt to illegally seize your property. We'll also send all the evidence about the embezzlement to the district attorney. And you get to go home and enjoy your property in peace. But peace was apparently not in the cards. That evening, as I was making dinner, I heard a loud crash from the front of the house. I ran to the living room to find that someone had thrown a brick through the front window. Attached to it with a rubber band was a note that read, "Leave while you still can." I called the police immediately. 2 officers arrived within 20 minutes and took a report. I told them about the ongoing dispute with the HOA and showed them the note. "We'll increase patrols in the area," one of the officers said, a young guy named Officer Martinez. "And you should document everything. Keep all correspondence, take photos of any damage or suspicious activity." "You think the HOA did this?" Officer Martinez exchanged a glance with his partner. "We can't speculate without evidence, but given the situation you've described, I'd say it's a possibility. Have you considered installing security cameras? My uncle had some. I need to find them and see if they still work." After the police left, I searched the house and found my uncle's security system in a closet. It was a decent setup with 4 cameras, but it had been unplugged. I spent the next 2 hours getting it working again and positioned the cameras to cover all the entrances and the driveway. The cameras proved their worth that same night. At 2 in the morning, motion alerts woke me up. I checked the feed on my phone and saw a figure dressed in dark clothing walking around the perimeter of the house, testing the windows and doors. I called 911 while watching the person try to force open a rear window. The police arrived quickly, but the intruder ran when they saw the patrol car's lights. The officers searched the area but didn't find anyone. However, I had crystal clear footage of the person on my security cameras. The next morning, I reviewed it carefully and felt my stomach drop. The intruder was wearing dark clothes and a hood, but during one moment when they looked up at the house, the motion sensor light caught their face clearly. It was Patricia Whitmore. I sent the footage to both Sarah and the police. Sarah called me within an hour. "This is exactly what we need. She's committed multiple crimes: trespassing, attempted breaking and entering, vandalism with the brick. Combined with everything else, this is going to bury her. Will the police arrest her? I'm pushing for it. I've sent the footage to the detective handling your case and strongly suggested they move forward with charges." 2 days later, I was sitting in my living room reading when I heard sirens outside. I looked out the window to see 2 police cars pull up in front of Patricia's house. which was just 4 doors down from mine in the same development. I watched as officers knocked on her door. Patricia answered, and even from a distance, I could see the shock on her face when they showed her a warrant. They arrested her right there on her front porch, handcuffing her while her neighbors watched from their windows and yards. Richard came running out of the house, yelling at the officers, but they ignored him. They put Patricia in the back of a patrol car and drove away. The neighborhood was buzzing with gossip within hours. I got a knock on my door from an elderly woman named Martha who lived across the street. "I heard Patricia got arrested," she said without preamble. "Does this have something to do with Gerald's house?" I invited her in and explained the situation. Her eyes got wider with each detail. "I knew something was wrong," she said when I finished. "Patricia has been acting strange for months. She kept telling everyone that this house was abandoned and that the HOA was going to sell it. But I saw Gerald here all the time until he got sick. I even visited him a few times before he went into hospice. Would you be willing to make a statement about that? It could help my case." "Absolutely. Patricia has been making life miserable for everyone in this neighborhood with her ridiculous rules and fines. Did you know she tried to fine me $500 because my mailbox was the wrong shade of black? The wrong shade. They're all black mailboxes, but apparently mine wasn't the exact right one from the approved list." Over the next few days, more neighbors came forward with similar stories. The HOA under Patricia's leadership had been tyrannical, issuing fines for minor or imaginary violations and threatening homeowners who pushed back. Several people had been trying to sell their homes just to get away from the constant harassment. Sarah used all of this information to build a comprehensive case. We filed a civil lawsuit against Patricia, Richard, and the HOA board for fraud, attempted theft, harassment, and a dozen other charges. We also provided all the evidence of embezzlement to the district attorney. The criminal charges came down first. Patricia was charged with criminal trespass, attempted burglary, vandalism, fraud, and theft. Richard was charged as an accomplice to the fraud and theft charges. 2 other HOA board members who had been helping them were also charged with fraud. The arraignment was a circus. Patricia showed up with an expensive criminal defense attorney and pleaded not guilty to everything. She glared at me across the courtroom like she wanted to set me on fire with her mind, but the evidence was overwhelming. The security footage alone was damning, but combined with all the documents showing their scheme to steal properties and embezzle HOA funds, they didn't have much of a defense. Richard tried to claim they'd made an honest mistake about the property's status, but the prosecution showed emails between him and Patricia discussing how they needed to wait until Gerald was out of the picture to make their move. They'd known he was alive and living in the house, but they'd been planning to seize it anyway. The trial took 3 weeks. I had to testify about finding the documents in my uncle's files and about the harassment I'd experienced. Other homeowners testified about the HOA's pattern of abusive behavior and suspicious financial practices. The forensic accountant Sarah had hired testified about the embezzlement, showing how Patricia and Richard had funneled over $200,000 from HOA funds into their personal accounts and their development company over a 3-year period. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. Patricia was found guilty on all counts. Richard was found guilty of fraud and conspiracy. The other 2 board members took plea deals and received probation in exchange for their testimony. At sentencing, the judge was harsh. Patricia got 6 years in state prison. Richard got 4 years. They were also ordered to pay full restitution to the HOA and to me personally for damages, legal fees, and emotional distress. The civil lawsuit was settled out of court. The HOA's insurance company paid a substantial sum to avoid the publicity of a trial. The money was distributed among all the homeowners who had been victims of Patricia's abusive tactics. The HOA was restructured with new leadership. The first thing they did was eliminate most of the ridiculous rules that Patricia had implemented. Mailboxes no longer had to be specific shades of black. Grass could be within a reasonable range of heights without triggering fines. Paint colors had a much broader range of options. Life in Sunset Ridge Estates got a lot more pleasant after that. As for me, I settled into my inherited home. I spent several months fixing it up, honoring my uncle's memory by taking care of the place he'd loved. I found more of his belongings tucked away in closets and drawers. Photo albums, journals, books he'd collected over the years. In one of his journals, I found an entry from about 3 years ago that made me both sad and angry. The HOA is relentless. Patricia came by again today, demanding I sell to her development company. When I refused, she threatened to make my life hell. She said she always gets what she wants, and she'll find a way to take my home no matter what I do. I told her I'd fight her every step of the way. This is my home. I built a life here. I won't let some power-hungry tyrant steal it from me. He'd fought them for years, documenting everything, preparing for the legal battle he knew was coming. But he died before he could see it through. I'd finished the fight for him, and in a way that felt right. Martha became a good friend. She'd bring over casseroles and cookies, and we'd sit on the porch talking about my uncle and the neighborhood's history. She told me stories about Gerald that made him come alive for me in ways I'd never known him. "He was a good man," she said one evening as we watched the sunset paint the Arizona sky in shades of orange and pink. "Stubborn but good. He would have been proud of how you stood up to Patricia. She tried to break him, but he never gave in. I wish I'd known what was happening. I should have visited more, stayed in touch better. You were living your life, dear. That's what he wanted for you. He talked about you sometimes, said you were doing important work overseas. He was proud of you." I'd been working as an engineer for an NGO, building water systems in developing countries. It had been fulfilling work, but it had kept me away from family for too long. My uncle's death and this whole ordeal had made me reconsider my priorities. I decided to stay in Prescott. I found work with a local engineering firm and made the house truly mine while still honoring my uncle's memory. I kept some of his furniture and belongings, adding my own touches gradually. The neighborhood transformed over the following year. Without Patricia's oppressive rules, people felt free to actually enjoy their homes. Kids played in yards without fear of getting their parents fined. People painted their houses colors they actually liked. The community became what it should have been all along, a place where neighbors looked out for each other instead of reporting each other for minor violations. I learned later that Summit Properties LLC had been part of an even larger scheme. Patricia and Richard had been planning to seize multiple properties in the development using similar tactics. They'd already been targeting 3 other homes belonging to elderly residents, hoping to catch them in violations or wait them out. Once their scheme was exposed, those homeowners came forward with their own stories of harassment. The lawsuits piled up. By the time everything was settled, Patricia and Richard had lost everything: their freedom, their business, their own home, and any hope of working in real estate or HOA management again. I sometimes wondered if they thought it had been worth it. They destroyed their lives and hurt countless people in pursuit of profit and power. And for what? They were sitting in prison while the people they'd tried to victimize were moving on with their lives. My uncle's property became truly mine, not just legally but emotionally. I made new memories there, hosted barbecues with the neighbors, planted a garden in the backyard that my uncle would have loved. Every time I walked through the door, I felt connected to him and grateful that I'd fought to keep what he'd left me. The legal battles had taken a toll, both financially and emotionally, but they'd been worth it. I'd learned that standing up to bullies and frauds was necessary, even when it was hard. I'd learned that documentation and evidence could make all the difference. And I'd learned that communities could heal and thrive once toxic leadership was removed. Sarah and I stayed in touch. She'd become a friend through the process, not just a lawyer. She told me the case had become somewhat famous in legal circles as an example of HOA overreach and fraud. "You'd be surprised how common this kind of thing is," she said during one of our catch-up calls. "Maybe not to this extreme, but HOAs abusing their power, boards embezzling funds, harassment of homeowners. Your case helped shine a light on it. Several news outlets had picked up the story." I gave a few interviews, hoping that sharing what happened might help other people facing similar situations. The responses I got were eye-opening. Dozens of people reached out to me with their own HOA horror stories, asking for advice on how to fight back. I started volunteering with a homeowners' rights organization, helping people understand their legal protections against HOA abuse. It wasn't work I'd ever imagined doing, but it felt meaningful. My uncle had fought to protect his home, and now I was helping others do the same. The house in Prescott became more than just an inheritance. It became a symbol of resistance against corruption and abuse of power. It became a home I'd truly fought for and earned. On the second anniversary of my uncle's death, I held a small memorial gathering at the house. Martha came, along with several other neighbors who'd known him. We shared stories, looked through photo albums, and toasted his memory with the whiskey he'd apparently loved. "He'd be so proud of you," Martha said again, her eyes misty. "You didn't just keep his house. You exposed corruption and made this neighborhood better for everyone." "I just did what he would have done," I replied. "He never backed down from bullies. I couldn't either." As the guests left and I cleaned up that evening, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't experienced in years. The fight was over. The bad guys were in prison. The house was mine, free and clear, with no one to challenge that fact. I walked through the rooms, remembering how I'd felt that first day when Patricia had shown up demanding I leave. I'd been confused and intimidated, unsure if I could win against people with resources and local power. But I'd stood my ground, gathered evidence, and fought back with everything I had. The next morning, I was having coffee on the back patio when Martha came over with a newspaper. "Have you seen this?" she asked, handing it to me. It was an article about HOA reform legislation being introduced in the Arizona state legislature. The article specifically cited my case and several others as examples of why stronger oversight and homeowner protections were needed. They're talking about requiring annual independent audits of HOA finances, limiting the fines HOAs can impose, and creating a state board to investigate complaints about HOA abuse, Martha said, reading over my shoulder. "Your case is making a real difference." I read through the article, feeling a mixture of pride and sadness. Pride that something good might come from the nightmare I'd gone through. Sadness that it had taken people like my uncle suffering for years before anyone paid attention. But maybe that was how change happened. Someone had to stand up and fight, even when it was hard, even when it seemed hopeless. My uncle had started that fight, and I'd finished it. Now maybe the system would change so others wouldn't have to go through the same thing. Life settled into a comfortable rhythm. I worked, maintained the house, spent time with friends and neighbors, and occasionally consulted on homeowner rights cases. The house appreciated in value, Not that I had any intention of selling. This was home now. 3 years after inheriting the property, I got a letter in the mail from the Arizona Department of Corrections. It was from Patricia. I almost threw it away without reading it, but curiosity got the better of me. The letter was short and didn't contain an apology. Instead, she complained about the unfairness of her sentence, claimed she'd been railroaded by a biased jury, and suggested that I'd somehow manipulated the system against her. She ended by saying she'd be appealing her conviction and would sue me for defamation once she was released. I showed the letter to Sarah, who laughed. She's delusional. Her appeals have all been denied. She's not getting out early and she has no grounds for a defamation suit. Ignore it. I threw the letter away and didn't give it another thought. Patricia was the past. She couldn't hurt me or anyone else anymore. The new HOA board, led by a retired schoolteacher named Helen Rodriguez, ran things completely differently. They focused on actual community improvement, organizing neighborhood events, maintaining common areas, and addressing real safety issues. Fines were rare and only issued for genuine problems, not aesthetic preferences. Under Helen's leadership, Sunset Ridge Estates became the kind of community it should have been from the start. Property values increased because people actually wanted to live there, not because of oppressive rules and regulations. I eventually met someone, a woman named Jennifer Harper, who worked as a teacher at the local high school. She was patient with my stories about the HOA battle and didn't think I was crazy for having fought so hard over a house. It wasn't about the house, she said when I tried to explain my motivations one evening. It was about justice and honoring your uncle. Anyone who doesn't understand that doesn't understand you. We dated for a year before she moved into the house with me. She brought her own furniture and belongings, and we blended our lives together in the space my uncle had left me. It felt right, like the house was continuing its story instead of being frozen as a memorial. When we got married 2 years later, we held the ceremony in the backyard. Martha was there, crying happy tears. Helen from the HOA gave a speech about how the neighborhood had transformed. Sarah came down from Portland with her family. Even some of the other homeowners who'd been victims of Patricia's schemes attended. Standing in that backyard, surrounded by friends and neighbors, I thought about my uncle and everything that had happened. The fight had been worth it. Not just because I'd won, but because it had led me here to this moment, to this life. The house that Patricia had tried to steal had become the foundation for everything good in my life. It had brought me home, given me purpose, connected me to community, and ultimately led me to love. My uncle would have been happy about that, I thought. He'd fought to protect this place because it mattered to him, because it was home. Now it was home to me and Jennifer, and maybe someday to our own family. As the reception wound down and guests started leaving, Martha pulled me aside. "Your uncle would be so proud," she said for probably the 100th time since I'd known her. But this time, she added something new. "Not just because you won against Patricia, but because you built a life here. That's what he really wanted. For this house to be a home filled with love and happiness. Thank you, Martha, for everything. For being there from the beginning, for testifying, for becoming such a good friend." She patted my hand. "That's what neighbors do, dear. We look out for each other." After everyone left, Jennifer and I sat on the back patio watching the stars come out over the Arizona desert. "You ever regret it?" she asked. "Fighting so hard for this place. It was years of stress and legal battles." I thought about it for a moment, then shook my head. "No. This house is more than just property. It's my uncle's legacy, and now it's ours. Some things are worth fighting for." She leaned her head on my shoulder. "I'm glad you fought. Otherwise, we wouldn't be here." Otherwise, Patricia and Richard would have stolen this place and sold it for profit. Someone else would be living here, and they'd never know the story of the man who refused to back down to bullies. We sat in comfortable silence, enjoying the peace of the evening. Somewhere in the neighborhood, I could hear kids playing and neighbors talking. Normal sounds of a normal neighborhood, free from the tyranny of an abusive HOA. The case had closed years ago, but its effects rippled outward. The HOA reform legislation had passed, providing stronger protections for homeowners across Arizona. Similar laws were being considered in other states. News articles and legal journals continued to reference my uncle's case as a cautionary tale about unchecked HOA power. Patricia remained in prison, her appeals denied. Richard was released after serving 3 years, but he'd lost his law license and left Arizona in disgrace. The other board members who'd been involved had faded into obscurity, their reputations destroyed. As for me, I'd found something I didn't know I was looking for when I'd inherited this property. A home, a purpose, and a community. The fight had been hard, but it had been worth every moment of stress and uncertainty. Years later, when people asked me about the HOA battle, I always told them the same thing. Stand your ground when you're in the right, document everything, and don't let bullies intimidate you. The system isn't perfect, but it can work if you're willing to fight for justice. My uncle had taught me that, even though he wasn't alive to see me learn the lesson. He'd stood up to Patricia and the corrupt HOA board, refusing to be intimidated or forced from his home. When I'd inherited his property, I'd inherited his fight too, and I'd won. The house stood as proof of that victory, a testament to the idea that ordinary people could stand up to corruption and abuse of power. It was my home now, truly and completely, with no one to challenge that fact ever again.